here, and for this session, we are going to be covering Overwatch League, but more generally, we're going to be covering the concepts of open leagues versus closed leagues. And when I refer to an open league versus a closed league, what I'm referring to here is open leagues would be more like the difference between Tier 2 and Tier 3 in Overwatch, the difference between open division and contenders, where in an open league, anyone could potentially join into some level of the feeder system, so that would be open division in this case. They can play through something, that would be the open division tournament where they'd do that. Then they'd potentially get into trials, and the top few teams from open division would go against the bottom couple teams from contenders, and the some number of winning teams in trials would go up to contenders. And that might be the same teams that were previously demoted from contenders that go right back up, or it may be some of those teams that came up from open division, and open division was open where anyone could play. That's what an open league is, whereas a closed league would be something like OWL, Overwatch League, where there are 20 teams. Only those 20 teams can play. There is no way for a contenders team to get in to OWL. Doesn't matter how good they are. It doesn't matter if they're just stomping all of the OWL teams in scrims. Doesn't matter if they're the best. They cannot get promoted based off of their performance. Now, an owner could go buy out their roster, or they could individually get picked apart and have 4 of their best players, for example, grabbed and split up to 3, 4 different teams, whatever the case may be. But there is no way just through winning, just through playing the game better, and winning their matches to guarantee or force their way into the top level in Overwatch. So Overwatch League is a closed league. And in North America, the US really, we really run most of our sports in a closed league format, whereas Europe much more frequently runs open league format. So that's sort of the background of what those two things are. So I'm going to use a Reddit post here that someone did to sort of go through their thoughts on why, as they say here, closed leagues are bad for global esports leagues. Now, the truth is, I will grant up front that I would mostly say that open leagues are more competitive. Audiences, fans tend to like open leagues more, but they do come with some drawbacks. So I'm going to take sort of the counter arguments here, and I'm going to attack this argument, hit it from some of its weak spots, and point out some of those places where, no, closed leagues really do have their benefits. And most of those benefits are tied to money, but that's not all just lining the owner's pockets money. Some of that is it's actually good for there to be more money in the scene. And something like Overwatch did not and was not initially going to be able to climb to the size of European football, what Americans would call soccer, sports in terms of their ability to host stadiums, things like that, have a well-running league. That would not have anytime soon been possible, so it potentially hugely jumped in its size, and money does some good things by being there. But let's get into it for now and take a look at this post. So we see closed leagues are bad for global esports league. I know there is some kind of cultural difference here because most of all of traditional sports leagues in the US are closed league instead of open league. However, as an EU viewer, I'm starting to get really bored with the closed league format. Is it the format that you're specifically bored with? Is it the game that you're bored with? Is it the meta that you're bored with? Well, let's actually find out. For me, there are 3 problems with closed league format: creativity, redemption arcs, and incentives. Okay, great. So he's set up his nice thesis here. Closed leagues are boring, and he's told us what his 3 major objections are going to be. We're reading a, high school English paper. Fine. Creativity. Closed leagues are bad for creativity. In an open league, you're under the constant pressure of Tier 2, Tier 3 teams that can get creative and compensate for the lack of star power by being better strategy and a better team cohesion. Okay. Of course, in most cases, those Tier 2, Tier 3 teams won't be successful, but from time to time, you'll get a very nice story. In an open league, you're under the pressure of the Tier 2 and Tier 3 teams. Right, because those teams can come for your spot. Okay, that's cool, but is that pressure like really stopping you from trying to win? Do we really think that the Shanghai Dragons season 1 who went 0-40 legendarily really weren't trying to win? They were trying their darndest to win, and it was clear that they were making improvements, that they were making better, but no team wanted to be the first team to lose to them. Everyone tried their absolute hardest when they went up against Shanghai as that record started getting pretty bad, because no one wanted to be the team that Shanghai Dragons got their first win off of, because it would have been hugely embarrassing. So like I think there's already constant pressure in these situations. There's no, oh well, we can just surf it. There's some of it, of course, but there's some of it in anything, even when relegation is a possibility, when, hey, there's always junk games, dead time, whatever you want to call it. Just like at the end of a game when you're leading by a huge number of points, it's junk time. At the end of a season, even when it's a season that has relegation or doesn't have relegation, if you get far enough behind, you get too many games behind, and winning an extra game or two isn't going to get you out of relegation danger. Or you get middle enough of the pack that you're not in playoffs but you're not relegated. Again, a couple games that aren't going to matter there. So you can say there's a little less in terms of there's a little more time that there isn't pressure, but there's still definitely pressure. And even in open leagues, there's times when it's still junk time. Okay. But I think that's really a different argument. I don't think that's the creativity argument. My first example of a lack of creativity in Overwatch League would be the GOATS comp. Bridget is released in February 2018. The season one season starts in January and ends in June, with the playoffs in July. Even if Dallas had some success with her during season 1 with a triple support backline, it's an unsponsored tier 3 team in open division that played the first iteration of GOATs, really. They were undefeated, except that it ended there. Won the Open Division? No, they didn't. But as there isn't any possibility for them to get higher, that's not what happened. They played it in a tournament. They played it in a tournament that was a third-party tournament, that was one of which was the Beat Invitational, and then there was another one, and there were two tournaments, maybe a couple weeks apart, maybe a month apart. They played it in that tournament, and they played it from the losers brackets, and they then went on to win that tournament. Then they went into the next tournament, which was a couple weeks, maybe a month later, and both of these tournaments were mixes of top tier 3 and contenders team. So top of tier 3 and contenders. And so this was a mix, which was a little unusual at the time. There weren't too many of those, but we did have two tournaments basically right in a row there. And then in the second tournament, they did the same thing, except what really made a name there was they beat Fusion University, who would have been that time's equivalent to like American Tornado, where Fusion University just won everything. Sometimes other academy teams would get close to them, but in North America, Fusion University won everything. They were the team. They, were the premier North American contenders team. They had obviously support from their host in Overwatch League, effectively. They had two-way players. They had, very famous players from Korea, all that stuff. Like, they were the team to beat. They were the academy team that would scrim L teams. And, that's fine. They were the team. And GOATs beat them. Okay, cool. So we already have in the Overwatch universe, there's some level of this creativity existing and it being found. And it got found in a tier 3 spot. And it got found by a team that, wasn't like, oh, they have this long history of success. They have all these things. It got found by a team in the lower bracket that had already lost and had to put something together and try. So it basically got played by a team that had nothing to lose. Well, even if you opened up the league, you'd still find that. These things would only really come from teams that have nothing to lose. Okay. That doesn't really work. Well, when do you have nothing to lose? Well, you have nothing to lose when you're kind of safe or when you're dead anyway. And that's not very much time. But okay, we'll continue. Anyway, I was mostly just fixing the history there. GOATS, the team, actually did not then go on to win Open Division. They did go on to get through Open Division, and I think they made it into Trials. I don't recall if they actually got promoted to contenders or not at that point. They might have. But the point is it doesn't matter. They had substitutes, like XQC substituted in and tanked for them at one time at the end of Open Division, or maybe in Trial, something like that. It was months later. Just the way the Open Division season works versus those tournaments. The tournaments were effectively run between Open Divisions, and it, wasn't like, okay, it's perfect anymore, that sort of thing. At the same time, at that time, some owl tried to use Goat's comp with limited success. In Europe and Korean contenders, Goats became dominant, while in NA it was Goats versus anti-Goats. Korea didn't adopt it immediately. That's a little bit of rewriting history there. But Korea did mostly adopt it. Korea did finally accept it and move over to Goats for longer. It started in NA. It went to EU hard. Korea eventually said fine and went that direction, while NA still had some Goats versus anti-Goats before NA finally had to cave and go full Goats. Sure. But most of the L teams during Season 1 didn't try Goats or weren't able to play it properly, so 6 months after Brig release, L teams weren't playing the meta. 6 months. Different patches have some things to do with that. That isn't really a closed league thing. That is the format that the league chose to run. That is, hey, they're choosing to do this on different patches. That is choosing to create a situation where your tier 1 teams and your tier 2 teams aren't going to practice against each other, even if they're good matches, because they're practicing 4 different versions of the game. That's not particularly good, and I'm glad that we got rid of that. I don't particularly see that as the reason that they're playing on different patches is because we want to keep them apart or because there's no promotion. Like, that's not why they're playing on different patches. They're playing on different patches because Blizzard hadn't figured out that they needed to line up that experience yet. So that's not really a closed league thing. They got to keep playing their thing because, again, different patches, and they got to tell themselves, oh, well, it's not effective on this patch, and they didn't get to play against the other teams, which they could have even in the system, and now you'll notice they do. You see lots of top academy teams playing against L teams. Yeah. Okay. Now imagine if the best tier 2, tier 3 teams would have been able to compete with L teams at some point, like during the playoffs. During the playoffs, why would they do it during the playoffs? You do it in relegation like you do it with trials between tier 2 and tier 3. You wouldn't do it in the playoffs. You might do it with the teams who didn't make the playoffs, but you don't want to pull hype away from the playoffs themselves. So you do it later after the playoffs in a quiet part of the season. Okay. Either the L teams would have moved much faster towards a GOAT comp, or at least one contenders team would have destroyed them. Imagine Runaway being able to compete during Owl playoffs in Season 1. Yeah, I mean, there are contenders teams that are better than Owl teams. That's not new, that's not a secret. Atlanta Academy was better than at least half of the league when it was at its peak. I'm sure Runaway was in a similar situation. I expect Fusion Uni probably wasn't quite that good when they were at their peak in early years, not the current Fusion Uni. But yeah, like, that's true. There's better teams on the outside. At the beginning of GOATS, when Owl did finally adopt it, going into their next season, which he's going to get to here, the top 2 to 4 EU teams were quite a bit better than all but the top two Owl teams. And I don't disagree that is a problem. That the top not being the top isn't good. But there's some benefits to it, which I'll get to as we keep going here. Second example would be the fact that GOATS comps lasted way too long. Is that because of the lack of patch? That's the usual narrative, but it isn't true. I mean, it's not just the lack of patch. There were some patches, none of them were just strong enough. It was also that people figured out that GOATS existed. Like, GOATS existed and was powerful and, like, really, really good. And they didn't hit hard enough nerfs to break GOATS when GOATS did take over, but then once they did start nerfing it, it's like, if you think of GOATS as a 100-step ladder, like, GOATS we can think of it as a 100-step ladder in terms of mastery of GOATS. And it really sucked to start learning GOATS because you'd learn on step 1, and you're just never going to beat a team that's on step 75. But if you're on step 75, or if you're on step 85 of your GOATS is still going to beat just about anything. Even if the meta swaps, or even if, things swap, it's gonna beat just about anything because it's been meta for so long that it hardens as the meta. And you see this. This isn't just unique to Overwatch. This isn't just unique to Owl. Where you're gonna get situations where, and I've talked about this. I actually did a collab with Spylo on this channel. You guys can look that up if you want. Where we talk about players are sticky. Metas are sticky. When metas get formed, obviously you look at what's changed, who does that make good, who does that make worse from a patch. But what you also are realizing is metas are sticky and that players want to play what they've been playing, what they know how to play, unless it actually gets broken by the next thing. So obviously, will new stuff get figured out? Yes, it will. Will, some level of competition of, oh, okay, we're not winning with this anymore, even if something else is just a little bit better, cause them to eventually move to the next thing? Yes, it will. But if you have a situation where the old meta is goats, and let's say this is the best thing that you can play on this patch, and now we hit a patch where the best thing you could play would actually now be a poke dive comp. This is the best thing that you could play, but you're starting here on your poke dive, whereas you're starting here on your goats on this patch. People are never going to figure out, by and large, that this is the best thing because it won't get enough success until people have climbed the ladder enough with it with their team to get up to here. And that is not strictly an open league versus closed league thing. That is how people are, how players are. That's the stickiness that exists in any meta because you really don't move until you start losing and actually find, oh, wait, we found the limits of this thing and we can't just climb more steps. There isn't another step to get up to here, that sort of thing. Oh, no problem. No problem, Joan Aaron. I reviewed one of your games a little while ago. Went from 3,800 to 4,100. No problem. You're welcome. You're welcome. Nicely done. Good climb. Okay. Back on topic here. It's the usual narrative, but it isn't true. Stage 2 and 3 were played on the same patch. They should have been on the same meta, right? They weren't. Well, no, metas aren't just a matter of patch. Metas partially have to do with patch, but what metas also have to do is what is expected outcomes based on variables outside of the game. Something can be the meta because the meta exists. It's not a vacuum. Like, yes, the patch helps contribute to the meta, but also you can get metas based on, or another influence of the meta is what are people playing. Like a ladder meta, for example. A ladder meta could be Zarya Hog. Is it the best thing in the world? No. But part of the meta is, oh, it's ladder, so more people are going to play more Zarya and more people are going to play Hog. That might not be the meta comp, the best thing in the world, but you might see more of it right when flex passes come out. Even if it's not the best comp and people don't actually think it's the best comp, you still, and what becomes good, what is successful for heroes to play, for compositions to play, exists in that environment of opponents are pretty frequently going to play this, or opponents are pretty frequently going to be playing dive because Winston is strong, or they're going to be playing dive because Ball is strong and Tracer is strong. Okay, that's unfortunate. We don't really like that. That's a bit of a problem that those heroes are being played. So dive is strong, but that's actually going to cause us to play more brawly heroes as a meta triangle answer to it, etc. And that's going to cause Brawl to be meta, not because Brawl is better than Dive. Dive is actually in a better place than Brawl right now, but Poke is weak or something along those lines, which means, therefore, Brawl is the thing that makes sense to play. Or you could have a situation where, hey, the best thing in the world right now is actually playing, again, let's go with, best thing in the world is playing Tracer, but people aren't good enough at Tracer yet, so people are playing Junkrat. I'm making this up. This meta didn't exist. Okay, well, heroes that are good against Junkrat are going to be doing better, picked blind out of the gate, played and practiced, than players against Tracer if not very many people are playing Tracer right now. And even if Tracer's actually balanced to be stronger right now. If people haven't realized that, the meta is referring to what is actually going on, what is actually being played. A meta isn't really just a single composition, it's what is being played. Like in GOATS, we might have said, hey, GOATS is meta, but part of what made up the GOATS meta was the existence of anti-GOATS comps, was the existence of quad DPS comps, was the existence of a few occasional silly like Bastion comps, things like that. Like that's what existed. Goats doesn't exist purely in a vacuum there. Okay. And for a while, you were seeing, for example, again, Goats wasn't hard meta, because if Goats was hard meta, and eventually it did become hard meta, you'd have had Zen Goats versus Zen Goats every time, and that is eventually where we got. But for a long time, Ana Goats hung out and existed, Ana Goats, because in North America, a fair amount of people stuck to and continued to try to play anti-dive. And again, that's the evolution. It wasn't a patch that finally forced people off of anti-goats. It was final acceptance, and that shifted the meta, and therefore you never blind rolled out on ana-goats after that went away. You blind rolled out on Zen goats because it was better in the goats mirror. Okay. Okay, so this is saying Gumps lost way too long, same patch, usual narrative, but isn't true. Stage 2 and 3 were played on the same patch. They should have been on the same meta, right? They weren't. Stage 2 was won by SF Shock playing Goats versus Vancouver playing Goat. Stage 3 was won by Shanghai playing non-Goat versus SF Shock playing Goat. Sure. But that's like just the finals, really. Like, that's not the whole stage. Like, yes, they won the stage finals, good for them, but if you looked at stage 1, 2, and 3, all of them were played as effectively goats. A lot of teams tried somber goats as well, but it was really Shanghai came into just the stage playoffs ready to go with some pretty strong, heavy anti-goat strategies, and they actually developed a further different way of playing anti-goats that did work for them. And I should point out, Shock made adjustments, and Shock played fine, and Shock almost got themselves back into that series playing a non-Goats comp, but you also get into, congratulations, they won a match. Would it have crushed Goats repeatedly? Would it have crushed Goats while being an acceptable number of swaps to get back to a comp that doesn't lose to something that Goats can get to with very minimal swaps? Hard to know. It's hard to know if that meta would have really worked itself back to Goats, because, like, yes, they won one weekend tournament. Cool. It's really hard to know. At that point, it was vaulted because we moved on to 2-2-2 lock. Anyway, doesn't need to be a Goats discussion. And then when you look at this final, Shanghai Dragons clearly won thanks to the meta. Why did it take so long for the L to abandon Goats meta? Well, it wasn't the best meta on every map. I mean, I'm not convinced that we've established it wasn't. I'm not convinced at all that we established it wasn't the best, quite frankly. We effectively had Shanghai Dragons beat Shock once in one match, and Shock did not have any chance to retool and go see, okay, can we force you back? Like, if that meta had continued to evolve, I'm not convinced that we wouldn't have gone back towards Goats. But it didn't. It got sealed by 2-2-2. Okay. And how is that possible? Well, most of the fan base was kind of bored with the Goats meta at this stage. What does that have to do with anything? The answer is meta inertia. Right. Play the comp your players know and they're good at. Don't try to be creative because it requires much more time to be efficient, and the other teams don't want to play you in screams, which should be scrims. So that's actually not a huge issue. You will occasionally run into the other team not wanting to play you in scrims. You can have some of that. You got some of that during Goats, I won't lie. But if you're winning a decent amount at the level that you're playing at, teams mostly want to practice against you. You might not want to practice against them, like, because they're going, hey, they want a little bit of time to figure out, and you're going, I don't want to let you figure me out before a match. And you might have the thing of, hey, we know we're up against a hard Goats team, as an example, so we don't want you this week. We'll take you next week, 2 weeks from now, whatever the case may be. But it's not that hard to get scrims when you play differently. Phase 1, I coached for Phase 2, and I coached for Phase 2 when Phase 1 was the absolute terror, the assumed winner of the next open division, all that sort of stuff, and they were an absolute terror, running around with Orisa, Reaper, Torb, all sorts of just silly comps, and no one else played like them, and everyone in Tier 3 was terrified of them, with good reason. And they were perfectly fine playing against Tier 2 teams in scrims as well. Now, when you're good enough, that happens. And it doesn't matter that you're playing different comps. People mostly want a good scrim, good practice, good strong resisting opponents. Would they like, as a sort of sugar on top thing, to get exactly the thing that they expect their opponents to play into? Yeah, they would, but you don't always control it, and we accept that you don't always control exactly what your opponents are going to play, because the scrim has to sort of be useful for both of you. You don't pick what your opponents play in scrims unless it's specifically a warm-up team or a warm-up scrim, and one team is helping you out as a favor, or you've hired a warm-up team like you would see in more professional leagues. You hire a warm-up team and you're paying them to play how and what you want them to play. But we haven't seen that catch on in Overwatch. There's simply not enough money in Overwatch for that to be the case. You do see some volunteer warm-up scrim type stuff where they will ask, hey, what do you want us to play, that sort of thing. Okay. Hey, Magdalena. Okay. You don't really care if you play meta if all the other teams in the league are playing the same comp that you are. In closed league, the meta is consensus of 20 teams involved. And in an open league, it's the consensus of the majority of the league. Like, that's what meta is. Meta is a reference to sort of what is being played. And okay, if we have this percentage of the ladder going Zarya Hog because, hey, they want to, and then we have this percentage of the ladder going, hey, let's play Rhine Zarya because it's Brawl because we think it's fun, even though it's not particularly good, and we have this portion of the ladder playing Ball Sigma because it's excellent and they want to, and, hey, they like to win, and, they're going to play the thing that they actually think is the best comp, and then we have this portion of the ladder playing, oh, I don't know, let's go with Diva Sigma because, hey, they're double off-tank players, but they don't like Hog, whatever the case may be. And then, I don't know, let's over here get some Orisa Sigma for a double shield thing. This might be the best comp, but what is the meta? It's not, oh, well, this is the biggest segment, so this is the meta. No, this is the meta. This whole thing is the meta that's going on. Okay. Semantics. So you haven't really changed that. You've made it bigger, and guess what? We call the meta GOATs, but those 2 to 3 teams that weren't playing GOATs were part of the meta as well, and that they were. Okay, in an open league, if you don't try to create creative and keep the consensus comp, you might get rolled by a tier 2, tier 3 team. No, you won't. You won't, and the reason that you mostly don't is because your talent is that much better. When you run into something that you haven't seen, sometimes they can catch you off guard if the talent level is similar, but what you run into is your players are so much more drilled, they can fall back to previous metas that they've played in, either together or not together, and they're mechanically better. And the reality is when someone comes up and is like, hey, I'm going to come up from tier 3 and challenge to tier 2, or we're going to come up as the bottom tier 2 team with our new thing to take the world by fire, even if you are the Korean Trials team that got big for their quad DPS usage in the GOATS era, which was a good strategy, don't get me wrong. It's cool. It's cool. You can catch maybe someone off guard, maybe beat them like it, and then it gets counter-stratted real quick. But even if you can't do it, they were able to take on, contenders teams with that. They were not able to take on the top contenders teams with that. They were not able to take on good owl teams with that. And that's how that works. Now, because the strategy worked against resisting opponents of the similar level, it did at a decently high level. It did get looks for, hey, is this something that should be implemented? And it did start seeing use in tier 3 everywhere, in some of the tier 2 type play, less so in Overwatch League. You could say, hey, that's because Overwatch League is a closed system, and that's fair, but there again was a good reason for that of, hey, this is a ladder system where there's 100 steps, and every time, the reason that GOATS didn't move on, seriously, is because every time someone tried to do something different, it might get them to here. It might get them to here. It might get them to here. And teams did try to do different things, by the way. They did. There was resistance, reluctance to play GOATs. But when a team is up here, when the Shock are up here, and you are a team that is looking at this, going, we're on step 10 of GOATs, Shock is on step 85, you are desperately looking for any sort of shortcut to take you up there, but eventually teams realized, wait, this isn't getting nerfed into oblivion by a patch. Wait, it is actually really good, and every time we break off to go do these things, they might initially be better than our GOATs, but this is the cap of how good it can be, and it's taking away from the time that we need to be climbing this goat step ladder one step at a time. It sucks, but that's actually how teams got there and why teams got there. It wasn't like, oh, if the league had been open, it would go away. Like, the reason that teams mostly stopped experimenting and trying to break goats is because every time they tried to go break goats with something else, because early there was a lot of trying to break goats. There was a lot of it. It was discovered, oh shoot, the cap of this, like, this will work against lower teams, but it just doesn't work against the better teams. And we can see that it can't be driven up much higher. Like, maybe we initially played it at this level, and this is as high as it's going to go. And the peak of goats is up here, and the top two goats teams, Shock and Vancouver, are up here. That's not going to work. Okay. That's why people were so resistant on goats. Like, they tried. Like, teams tried like wild to break goats, and they also did it in scrims. Like, keep in mind, the league matches are sort of what you see there, but they tried heavily in scrims to try to break goats, and they did some in league matches as well to break goats. It just mostly didn't work. You only had 2 to 3 teams that just hard committed to no, we're not playing it, and most of us looked at it and went, okay, you are committing yourself to a situation where you're going to be in the bottom half, probably the bottom third of the league, and that was the case for most of them. But Shanghai Dragons did find a breakthrough and managed to make their good little run and then take down Shock. Again, I don't know that that would have lasted, and if it hadn't lasted, if it had been oh no, we see the steps that we need to take to beat this, they're then locked out and don't have a way to get back up there. And again, there's not much higher that they can push it. Again, this wasn't supposed to be a GOATS discussion, but I know GOATS pretty well, so it turned into one. No big deal. If you don't get creative and keep the consensual comp, you might get rolled by a tier 2, tier 3 team. Yeah, not really a huge issue because, again, they did try. It just didn't work by and large. And also, especially at the time of GOATS, the distance between most of Tier 2 and Tier 1 was actually pretty big. Outside of GOATS, at the beginning of the OWL season, the EU teams and some of the top NA teams, really the top NA team, were better than the bottom half, at least, of the Overwatch League at GOATS. Same thing with Korea, better than the bottom half of the Overwatch League. But for most of the time and for most comps that weren't GOATS, even if the other team is better strategically than you, you've gotten a hold of the best players, and I'm sorry, that is the difference. There's a reason that when you're building a team, you go, well, let's get the 6 most mechanically gifted people that we can, and then we'll figure it out from there. Okay. When asked about this period and why only Chengdu and Shanghai get creative, most coaches and GMs answer that's because of meta inertia. I think I gave a much more detailed answer than that, but that is part of it, sure. Most knew that GOATS wasn't the best comp on all map situations anymore. They were wrong. They all wanted that to be true. They all wanted that to be the case. There may have been a couple exceptions, like Gibraltar, where it might not have been the best thing. But again, you have this thing that you're practicing that's this 100-step ladder. How much time are you going to take off? Because if you keep climbing this ladder one step at a time, it helps your win rate across all of the maps. If you try to break it to go, no, there's these 2 maps that we want to play something else on in the entire map pool. Okay, how much time do you want to devote to learning something that's a little better on a couple maps when there's clearly 30 steps between you and Vancouver? Not very much. Not very much, because you've got catching up to do, and you can, like, start winning points, but you're not going to win matches. You follow what I'm saying? It's like, yes, we've done this and we've gotten ourselves better. Yes, hey, we took that map. That's cool. That's cool, but you have to win matches, not just shift a point here and there. You have to actually get better at a comp that you can run the majority of the time. If it's not the comp you're running 50% plus of the time, most of the time as a coach, you're going to go, can we use one of the comps we already have or retool it very slightly? You don't want to spend a ton of time working with your team on something that you're going to use in 2 places. In fact, you'd rather kind of brute force another comp into working on those that you're already practice on so it doesn't steal away your practice time, especially when it's clear that, again, you're 30 steps behind Vancouver, Shock, whatever. Most knew that GOATS wasn't the best comp on all map situations anymore. That was wishful thinking on many of their parts, but it was easier to find scrims and play GOATS than to go for higher risk-reward comp. Not really. There were lots of players who wanted to and were willing to play other things, and they correctly realized that when they tried, GOATS beat them. I'm serious. I'm serious. At worst, you'll end up last of the league, and there was no real consequence for that anyway. That's not really true. I mean, getting the award for like the worst professional team in all of recorded history, their 0-40 losing streak. Like, no, that's kind of a consequence. Shanghai didn't want to hold that L. There's consequences for that, and there's fan backlash, and the league comes and talks to you and says, "Hey, why are you having one of your players drive a bus when you're the second worst team in the league?" And hey, you guys may have the minimum required number of players, but this is pathetic. What are you doing? You aren't up to the competitive level of the league. You get talked to by the league, by your peers as other teams. The community thinks poorly of you, and your investment doesn't go well. Like, of course, there's consequences for it. Closed leagues are really bad for creativity. You're calling that a conclusion to this section, but this hasn't established actually that we don't have creativity because the league was closed. Like, these teams tried to be creative. You did not see what these teams did in their scrims. They went back to it because GOATS was incredibly intricate and lasted a long time, and it was made clear that Blizzard was not willing to use a hard enough hammer to break it, and they knew that they were stuck on a patch for an entire stage, and then an entire another stage. So if you're early in that stage, you know that you're on it for the next thing. You want to go ahead and invest in, hey, we're reluctantly, now that we've been in this for months, going to go, okay, we'll climb the step ladder one thing at a time, because otherwise our losses just get uglier and uglier. The difference between the teams that had a very good GOATS, a competent GOATS, and a bad GOATS was huge and obvious. Redemption. Here we are in the interseason. As a French viewer, I was naturally a fan of the French players and more generally the EU players. I also love redemption stories. We have a ton of those now, and it's nice. Fearless going from the 0-40 Shanghai Dragons in Season 1 to dominant Shanghai Dragons in Season 2 and 3, and Dallas in Season 4. There are a lot of other examples, sure. However, with the closed league format, to be able to get some nice redemption arcs, we first need players and coaches to be on a team. Yeah, you do, sure. Tier 2-3 is dead because you won't get any visibility there. Okay. That doesn't mean you can't get a redemption story there, but okay. So sponsors aren't interested, teams have no money, no coaching structure. If you don't make it to the L, you're basically out of the game. Oh boy. Okay. So let's get into this because, like, that's sort of true, but this is the self-defeating portion of your argument. So we've got open leagues and we've got closed leagues. And that's cool. What do we get out of open leagues? We get higher levels of competition. Because if you do poorly, you get demoted. If you do well, you get promoted. That's great. That makes it fun. It feels like, hey, this is merit-based. You play well, you move up. That's what you got to do. You don't have to market yourself. You don't have to be like, hey, we have the best social media presence. Hey, we, are making the most money and that's what's making us successful. No, if we're winning, we get to move up. Okay, cool. As a population, we like that. That is cool. That is a good thing. I'm down. Sounds good to me. Some problems with that. And why you might look at a closed league. There's more money. Okay, but temporal, there's more money. Who cares that there's more money? I don't care that owners are making more money. I want to watch the best Overwatch that we possibly can. Okay, so here's the thing. If there's more money, remember that, it's better, higher level competition when you have the open league? Well, if there's more money, you can actually afford to pay players more, and if you can afford to pay players more, or coaches more, or staff more, you can end up in situations where, hey, that open league, especially when it's something not as big as football or soccer, depending on what country you're in, where, hey, it's got this huge legacy of forever being played, whatever, you end up in a situation where, hey, more money means people can actually afford to stick in the scene. Now, that doesn't work in Overwatch. You'll notice that in Tier 2, for example, you might be the best. You might be Sugar Free, where, he was a fantastic player. Sugar Free was a fantastic player in Contenders, but he was too young. He was too young for Owl. So he was stuck over in the Open League, and the money just isn't very good. Even when you're winning it every season, the money's okay, but it's only okay if you're winning it every season, and it's not good. Like, it's far from good. So people who might be the best at something like Overwatch go, oh, hey, the Open League just doesn't have enough money in it, so I'm going to move on and do something not related to the esport. I'm going to go become an accountant. I'm going to go work at Radio Shack, where the pay is more predictable, for the number of hours. Not Radio Shack. Okay, that's gone. Best Buy. I'm going to go, do whatever the case may be. Like, okay, you don't necessarily have the best competition, the most competitive thing by having an open league if people can't afford to, if people go, hey, this doesn't make sense for the amount being invested, whereas a closed league, it's easier to get more money out of. Okay, so money. So maybe competition isn't quite so much of a negative in terms of the level of competitiveness. Well, why does it have more money? Like, okay, it's got more money. Like, you could make more money in an open league than in a closed league. You sort of could, but you've got some issues. First off, orgs aren't going to be able to invest as much, or aren't going to be willing to invest as much if they don't know if they're going to be in the scene long term, if they don't know if they can stick. It's pretty clear. You guys all understand, some of you understand how investment works, where, hey, you're willing to put more money into something if you know that, hey, you can't lose it. It can't just be taken away from you. Yes, of course, the whole league could collapse in a closed league format. Hint, that's kind of one might argue that that's something that happened here. But if you have the potential of going, hey, I'm investing in this league, I'm building a team, I'm doing it at whatever. I've got a team here, and I don't know how much I'm going to have to invest next season whatsoever, because I don't know if other people are going to come along and build super teams on a shoestring budget, because that's really easy to do in open leagues. For example, you could have never had Owl with its $20 million buy-in, and then you can have a $20 million buy-in to get in, or you can win contenders to get in, and the bottom league will get relegated because no one would have spent $20 million on a spot when they could potentially get relegated, especially when you could have built a contenders super team that had like a 50% chance of getting a spot on, easily like 5% of the budget. Like, okay, well, of course, at that point, you're going to go, hey, let's go build the absolute best contenders team and get ourselves a 50% chance of getting in, that sort of thing. So you can't do it in a system like that. But even if you just never had those buy-ins, never had that sort of thing, you as a league or you as an owner are much less likely to just invest into having a team when there isn't very much stability there. When you're not sure, like, okay, this is how much it costs to run a team this season, but I could have a bunch of my players poached next season if the amount of money that's going to be in the scene is vastly different next season, and I'm not willing to pay more. And if people start going, oh, hey, and then this good investment becomes a bad investment, but I have to keep this level of investment in order to have not lost the value of my previous investment, and oh, shoot, that sort of thing. So you generally aren't going to get as much org investment in open league type stuff as closed league stuff. Now, you might get more orgs forming. You might get new orgs. Might get lots of new, hey, rah, we're going on raw energy, raw drive in open league formats, but that gets us to the new place, which is sponsorships. Now, I get the irony here. Activision Blizzard has not done well with sponsorships, with some of their latest scandals, sponsors pulling out, threatening to pull out, considering their investment, that sort of thing. But historically, that's been the exception, not the norm. And you're much more worried about an open league with very inexperienced staff, players that aren't really being managed by their staff because their staff, are overworked, don't have, their players don't have media training, that sort of thing. Your players are a lot more likely to do things that are not acceptable to a mainstream audience, to post things that are not acceptable maybe on social media or maybe in match chat or whatever the case may be, to not generally be presentable. Well, when that happens, sponsors don't want anything to do with a league. And that is more likely in an open league than a small league. Can you still get some sponsors? Absolutely. But you're going to get them for less. And they're going to be more shady sponsors. And them being more shady sponsors is going to cause your league to be considered a little more shady, a little more on the edge, that sort of thing, and get less mainstream appeal and not grow and not get bigger, better sponsors. The other thing you're going to have is these things in these open leagues, it's very easy to get fly by your shoestring orgs that are ripping players off or signing them to bad contracts or getting them on a contract for basically nothing and then getting non-disparagement clauses in there, owning them basically forever. Some of this stuff that isn't enforceable isn't doable, but guess what? You'll still get blackballed by other portions of the league if you sign one of these contracts, but it's not enforceable. And these players don't know what they're doing. They're going, oh, I need to sign because I'm going to get money for playing a video game, anything, whatever. And they tie themselves up and do poorly. Like it's not all good, and you're always going to have more of that in an open league than in a bad league. So your players are going to get a little more shafted, we'll effectively say, by bad contracts, not knowing what they're doing. You're going to have a harder time getting sponsorship dollars. It's going to be worse sponsors, less money. And when you do get it, you're not going to have those good teams that you'd have in a closed league or with more experienced orgs. You can have the more experienced orgs and they can exist in an open league and they know how to do these things, and that's fine. Like you put, for example, I don't know, a Cloud9 in an open league and they'll be just fine, but you're always going to have more newer to the scene type orgs trying to show up that maybe aren't even orgs yet, and they're going to not know how to appropriately get sponsorships out of companies or how to hardball negotiations, and they're going to give away the farm for nothing. Like, they're not going to be as good negotiators for getting real sponsorship money there. Not getting real sponsorship money, not getting real ad money means, again, you have less money in the scene. That means you have lower production quality. That means you have worse tournaments. That means you're not paying the players as much. That means the players go elsewhere. That means you have more people trying to do more on less, which means your orgs also, again, get even more shady with like, okay, what can we do with contracts in this? And, let's build a Ponzi scheme and all that good stuff. So a lot of the benefits of closed leagues do go back to money, quite frankly, and like, hey, evil capitalism, whatever. But the reality is, you kind of need money to work, and Overwatch isn't football, soccer. Like it's not, oh, it's been around forever. People have been playing it forever, and oh, cities are going to work together to build stadiums for it, that sort of thing. Like, no, it's not there, and it was never going to be there. Does that mean that it couldn't have been successful as an open league? Of course not. Of course it could have been successful as an open league. It probably never would have gotten to the level of Overwatch League's peak success there in terms of, oh, wait, maybe this is a thing, maybe this is happening, but it absolutely could have been successful, and it could have been rolling along the way it did with Alienware monthly melees and Apex, not the game, but the effectively tournament that was hosted in Korea that was considered the top tournament for a while, things like that. Those things could have continued and probably grown and gained popularity, and they would be bigger probably than Tier 2 is right now. But no, it probably never would have really been the size that Owl was, etc. Okay. Okay. There's that. And then you get into more stuff where you can't really do some of the region stuff that was a cool idea that Overwatch League happened, didn't really pan out. They sort of backed away from it and went to like, okay, we'll do some homestead type things as opposed to constant home games rotating around the globe. I'm still hopeful that Collegiate can grab that torch and hold it because it's actually really interesting. Not necessarily with the players traveling, but the locality is a way to get additional people buy-in who aren't already extremely strong followers to get people a little more engaged as a potential audience is a really powerful tool. And Owl didn't ultimately get to capitalize on it the way it was supposed to. Hopefully Collegiate will be able to. Again, that becomes much, much harder in an open league format when you can't count on teams to be able to build stadiums because, oh, well, we won our way up here via promotion. Okay, but can you afford a place to actually host your games, that sort of thing, to actually do home games? Well, no. Okay, well, that's not going to work then unless you have the league pay for it. But how does the league pay for things? Well, is it going to tax its teams? Well, that again doesn't really work if you won your way in here by merit and you don't have any money and you didn't have good experienced staff that were doing, okay, well, we're merchandising, we have this good social media presence, we're getting paid over here by this sponsorship deal, we actually are, running this here, like, okay, again, that doesn't really work. Okay. Reason why some players are selected and others aren't are not very clear. Yeah, there's a scouting problem. There's always been a scouting problem. But that's not exclusive to Overwatch. People, that's not exclusive to Overwatch. That there's a scouting problem. People don't want to be public about why players are picked and not picked. How do I want to put this? The best players are not always picked. There's always some level of networking. Congratulations, that is the human existence. The best people are not always also picked to be accountants, lawyers, to get promoted to, directors, to get picked to be the CEO. Like, the best person for the job is rarely picked. I mean, sometimes the more positive way of looking at that would be it's not what you know, it's who knows what you know. That would be the positive way of looking at that. The less positive way of looking at that would be it's not what you know, it's who you know. And congratulations, that's true in like everything. Sorry. Most of life is like that. And anything that has any degree of subjectiveness to it, that isn't strictly this is a multiple choice test, or, okay, this is purely a numbers thing of how far did you throw the shot put? Well, okay, you clearly threw the shot put the furthest. Anytime that there's something subjective like that, well, how much did this player versus this player contribute to this team winning versus losing? Now subjectiveness gets involved. Okay, now as soon as any level of subjectiveness is involved, you're going to have some level of who you know involved. It isn't a pure on merit basis, right? Think about it this way. Do you really believe that it wasn't possible to get better players and coaching during season 4 than the ones selected by London, Vancouver, and Valiant, while only taking players that weren't AL players? No, but you have to pay someone to do that scouting. Unless you're just going to source it to Reddit. You don't want to do that. You've got to pay someone to do that, and then you've got to take their word for it. That's how it works. You have to get someone's expertise. If we look at, what was it, Dallas? I mean, they hired Flame to be their GM in the first season, and the reason that they did it is because he was a somewhat known analyst, and they went, hey, you're somewhat known, you're also somewhat professional, somewhat out there, somewhat big, so you'll bring some level of fandom, you have some level of professionalism, because clearly you're able to interact with outside media, you have a professional tech job, whatever, so you're not just that cringe sport type thing, just that you have some level of real to you, but you also know this really well, so we're going to hire you to do your scouting to pick the players. And he did okay, but he clearly didn't build the best team in the world. And, yeah, you can do that, but again, he had to be paid to go be their GM. And if you want to do that, you have to pay someone to go do those things. And if you're going, we want to hire the absolute worst players, you're probably also not hiring the best coach to do your scouting. Or if you are hiring a good coach to do your scouting, maybe they're not particularly a good scouting coach. They're a much better strategic coach, or they're a much better micro coach, or whatever the thing may be. Or like you're like, hey, you did well over here. You did well in Korean Contenders, so we want you to go be our coach. And that's cool and all, except that scouting wasn't in their job description, or they only look at Korea, they don't look at other regions, or vice versa. Like you can look at that however you want, and if you were looking to hire those, the cheapest players at the minimum you could, you probably weren't getting the best coach you absolutely could, you probably weren't giving them a ton of support. You might have been getting other people involved in like, hey, well, we want this person because they'll be a good face for the team, even if they're not the best fit on your team, whatever. Or you may have already signed some players before you brought them on, sort of thing. Like, lots of things go wrong there. It's politics. It always is. We need to ask Lieutenant Surge to do this video later. I think Lieutenant Surge needs his own channel, and he can copy all of Temporal's content. Got it. Got it. Giving the Lieutenant Surge spin on it. That could be fun. That could be fun. Okay. In an open league, we would have far more eager coaches building tier 2, 3 teams with players that aren't selected in OWL teams, and we would have some very nice stories. So the problem that you run into with this is, do these tier 2, tier 3 coaches magically have money? Do they magically have money? Are they paying players now? Are they giving out guaranteed things? Oh, they don't? Huh. So they just have to get the best tier 2, tier 3 players together based on, hey, I'm good, you're good, let's work together. That works sometimes. I can go do that. I can go work with players that I've worked with before and go do some of that. But the problem that you run into is when you're actually roster building, if you're not going, hey, dollar signs, we have money, what you're actually recruiting based off of is who else they're going to go work with. So if I were to go get, let's see, a couple of them have been promoted, but let's go say I wanted to build a line with a tank line, a team with players that I've worked with, and I wanted to go, hey, let's get Dan's, let's get False. Okay, these are two no names. They probably wouldn't have trouble working together. No problem. But then let's say I want to go get some randoms over here. And maybe we'll go here with con. Sure, whatever. Let's say I want to get these randoms because I have done great scouting. I'm fantastic at this. I have found the best players, but this one is going to need some polish, and I know they're going to need some polish. And these two are fantastic, and I think the rest of the players will get that they're fantastic, but they don't have any sort of record. Okay, I might be able to, based on my prestige, based on my, hey, I've worked with these players before, go, hey, let's go ahead and do this. Trust me, guys, these guys are going to be good. If they're not crushing it in the first few scrimmages, these players, and it's not specifically these guys. I might be able to twist the arms of some of these guys if I had to. But even players that you've worked with before are going to say, hey, no, I only want to go be on this team if you can also get me, oh, who would a good example be right now? If we're also going to have, totally blanking right now. If we're also going to have so-and-so on the team or so-and-so on the team, like if we're going to have players that they recognize and they're 100% sure they can win with. And again, that's not a knock on them. That's how it works, because when you're not being tied in by a contract because you're in tier 2, tier 3, and you don't have money to throw around, that's what's going to happen. Like, that's fine. That's how that works. And most of team building is secure enough good pieces to be able to secure other good pieces. And being a good coach is good for that. Being a good manager is good for that. Being a good player can be good for that, because you go and play with preferably not just your friends, but the best people that you can play with. Like, it's not just a case of, oh, well, the best scouting in tier 2 and tier 3 will go do this. Not unless you have some leverage. And a team that did a good job of this was Second Wind. Second Wind owned their contender spot. They, the org, owned the contender spot, even though, no, they weren't a real org. And they were able to go, hey, it's our contender spot, and too bad, you're stuck with us. You're gonna play with us, or you're not gonna play in contenders. And they were actually able to do that much more successfully, because this was when contenders was still an open league, and it's still an open league, but contenders had much less rollover. You'd only have 2 seasons a year. They tried 3, but really it was 2, and they'd be like 4-month seasons. So if you're not playing with us, you're probably not playing, because it's going to be a long time until the next open division, until anyone has a chance to get in here, that sort of thing. And, oh, you use your leverage and then you're able to do that sort of thing. It's way harder now when you have a tournament like almost basically every 2 months in contenders, if we continue to have that going forward. But, the structure that they moved to really 2 years ago there, way harder to do that sort of thing. And so, again, I don't know that you'd actually have far more eager coaches building tier 2, tier 3 teams. You already have plenty eager coaches building teams. You have plenty eager players building teams. Being eager isn't good enough. You have to also win. And if you do win, and you win consistently, you do tend to move up. If you do quite well in Tier 2, when you do it consistently, you can force your way into the good old boys club. That said, it does take too long. It does take too long because, hey, you have to win too many times for too long. And obviously there is some factor of, who luck, all those sorts of things involved. But the coaches were plenty eager, as were the players. Okay. Imagine if Get Amazed had the possibility to build a tier 2 team right now. He could easily get Ben Best, Oni, Suna, and FD. I'm sure he could find an off support and projectile DPS, but he wouldn't do it. Why? Because tier 2, tier 3 is meaningless. Maybe. Or maybe you'd hear FD say Ben Best is washed. Or Oni say Suna is washed. I don't want to play with them. That sort of thing. You got to get someone better. That's sort of how it works. Now he might go, no, it's mine. I'm running this. I'm going to be in charge. And if you want to be on the team, you've totally got to buy into that. But that's actually really hard to do when you aren't wielding money or a contract. Like, dead serious. You could sort of wield it with, ownership of a contender spot, but like that's actually quite challenging to do when you don't have full backing of an org. Like, more so than people think. And it's not supposed to be done. I mean, you have to coach differently when you're working without an org, without players, without org support, or not without players, without an org, without org support, without money, than you do when you have it. And that's a skill, and it's one of the reasons why the path to pro for coaches is a little wonky. Coaches don't always have full control of exactly what's happening. Anyway, doesn't matter. Okay. So no, he's not doing it because tier 2, tier 3 is meaningless. He's not doing it, and these guys aren't doing it because they aren't sure they could win. They don't want to go spend time in contenders and not win, and neither does he because that would look bad. If you're going to go in, if you're going to pull the trigger, you better win. Because now, oh, you're not an owl player who's not an owl right now temporarily. You're a contenders player who got 5th place. Oh. Huh. Yeah, they don't do that. I mean, some of them do, but that's because they're going, hey, I desperately need this tournament money, whatever. Or they're committed to long-term being on the grind. Okay. They won't be able to compete versus Owl Team ever. I mean, they can scrim against Owl teams. That's not really true, is the thing. Like, even with the closed league, the top contenders teams, if they're dominantly on top, scrim against Owl teams. Because Owl teams are always looking for good scrims. And guess what? If you start scrimming against Owl teams and doing well, word gets around and you get to scrim against other Owl teams. If you do well against Owl teams in Owl scrims, guess what? They know who your players are, and your players are suddenly on short lists for tryouts. Huh. Funny how that works. They won't be able to compete versus Owl teams. They'll be able to scrimmage against them, though. The only thing that them being able to compete, like, for real, rather than in scrimmages against Owl teams does, is it lets the public see the competition, and then the public is able to put more pressure on the team to go, they're kicking your butt, why are they not signed to Owl teams? That's the only thing that we're really getting here in terms of the benefit of being able to go against L teams. They already can scrimmage against L teams. Like, guys, runaway scrimmed against Owl teams when the correct timing in the seasons allowed for it, when patches allowed for it, as did Fusion Uni, as did Atlanta Academy, as did American Tornado, as did Revival. Like, this isn't some new concept. And an open league with real perspectives and real sponsors and real prize money, whoa, they would go for it, and it would be super motivated, and they would destroy bottom tier L teams. Whoa. We skipped like 60 steps. Okay. Real sponsors. I'm sorry. You're not going to get Toyota to do nearly as large a sponsorship for open leagues that are effectively like the size of what Apex or the Alienware monthly mealies were, or even a little bit bigger. You're not going to get real sponsorships for things that are run like the Alienware monthly mealie was, of that size, Like those are not going to get owl level sponsorships. It's not going to happen. Now, might you get sponsorships for, oh, let's say, what are some of the things for gambling websites to bet on sports? Yeah, you probably could. Or for, um, you know, adult entertainment type things, yeah, you might. Some of those things that are on the hey, do not sponsor list, you might get decent sized sponsorships from some of them. You could also get, hey, maybe you get more reputable sponsors, like for example, Red Bull. Red Bull is sponsors in sports all the time, but they're going to throw in less money. You might still get good HP sponsorships, but they're going to throw in less money than they did for Owl because they're sponsoring a less big thing, and they're a little less, or they're also a little more worried about what's going to be up there, what's going to go on there. Are the player, are they going to sponsor it, and then the casters are going to say something incredibly stupid, or they're going to let out a very unpolished product, or they're going to be showing match chat, and the players are going to be BMing each other in ways that don't reflect well on their brand. Like, these are real things that you worry about, and it's part of why. And you're also going to have orgs that are not nearly as competent at talking to companies to get sponsorships out of them or understand what they're worth because they've never done it before, and therefore don't actually get very large sponsorships out of them when they sell something like the team name rights, things like that. You don't get the same amount of money. Temporal get a sponsorship from Purple? Sure. That would be fine. Go find other places to go get sponsorships from. Okay. Uh-huh. It'll happen after this, Magdalena. For the narratives for the fans, it's much better. Every fan likes some players and coaches. There are some Depe fans that are really frustrated right now. Imagine the hype if Depe was trying to build a team to compete in Tier 2 with the objective to beat Tier 1 teams. It would be insane. I mean, didn't we see that effectively happen with Revival? Like, that was Revival had some ex-Owl players on it. It had Owl staff effectively that I want to say was ownership. I want to say it had former Owl staff coaching it. Like, that effectively happened with Revival, and either your players and staff get picked up at that point, not as a team, but individually, or they don't. But that happened, and it showed up, and mostly American Tornado still beat it. Okay. Same goes for a ton of Korean teams. Element, Mystic, and Runaway would still exist. Okay, how are we getting them there? Are they playing online? Are we playing from Korea to North American Owl online? What are we doing there? Okay. Anyway, closed leagues are very bad at providing some nice redemption arcs and really frustrating for the fans. I mean, sort of. Like, you don't see the redemption arcs as nice, but it's a pretty cool redemption arc still. If it's just there aren't very many redemption arcs, you see, hey, someone gets sent down to, someone loses an owl and they either retire because the money just isn't very good in Contenders, which is an open league. And I know it's an open league that's existing under a closed league, so the money would be a little better if Owl didn't exist. But the money would not be Owl good if Owl didn't exist. Owl can't afford to be Owl good with its money, but hey. But you see lots of things. There's lots of coaches who went down to Contenders after not doing well in Owl, and then they couldn't just win, so then they left the scene. You didn't find them back in Contenders. You instead found pros who used to be on teams who hadn't done any coaches finding slots as coaches, even as Owl assistant coaches, things like that. Like, I mean, you might want the redemption stories. There's a couple, but they're mostly not there, and the route to get them still does exist. But again, people don't want egg in their face. They don't necessarily want to go mess up. That or money is why we haven't seen Get Amazed build a team with Best, Oni, Suna, and FD. Okay. Shanghai Dragons were the best redemption arc. They were a pretty great redemption arc. Incentive. The last point is the most obvious. The lack of incentive for bottom teams to compete when they know they're at the bottom. I don't think that's true. Like, The Shanghai Dragons in season 1, you could see that they were trying. They were getting sweaty. They were trying to win. They just weren't good enough. And you saw similar things with Florida. The Mayhem absolutely tried in that season 1 when they were terrible. They were trying. They just didn't have good enough players. Like, they didn't. They didn't have good enough players. They made the wrong signings. They went and added someone to the team, but they go add someone to the team in a position that they're already strong in. Like, okay, this isn't some, oh, they're phoning it in because they're losing. They absolutely wanted to win there in season 1. It's just they weren't good enough. Yes, there's a garbage time problem. There's always a garbage time problem. We mostly can't eliminate garbage time in sports, and yes, you do get less garbage time depending on how it's set up, how it's functioning with a open league than a closed league, but there's still garbage time in both. In an open league, you can lose your spot in T1. Stories like Season 3 Boston, Season 3-4 Vancouver, Season 4 Vancouver, and Valiant wouldn't exist. You aren't giving up right from the start, trying to minimize the budget, and not even really trying. Right. Instead, what you have is someone who's in tier 1 goes, wait, we can't do it anymore. We're not honoring our contracts. We're not paying. We're declaring bankruptcy in the middle of the season. Wait, what? Or, hey, we were going to pay you guys, but the prize money never came through. So we needed the prize money to pay your salaries. And, so and so, because they're a large company, is doing net 90-day payments, not paying immediately, and we owe you immediately, and our players are not getting paid, that sort of thing. You see lots of that when you have more accessibility into these sorts of leagues. Blizzard, obviously, that doesn't happen in Owl, because in Owl, Blizzard goes, hey, we're not going to stand for any of that. We can afford to not stand for that because we get to be a powerful league, in part because we're a closed league, but also we vetted you guys. We made sure that you could do more than afford the buy-in. That was why Rogue, the team that was one of the two best teams in the West at the time Owl was forming, before Owl it would have been considered one of the two best teams in Western Overwatch. They got their 20 million together and they went, hey, we're ready to be an Owl, and Owl said no, because you don't have anything behind this. We can see that your finances, you have enough to get in, but you don't have anything behind it, and we're not going to chance any situations where you become insolvent, you can't pay your staff, you can't pay your players, you have no meaningful media presence, whatever the case may be. And again, that can be done in an open league. It obviously can be done. You can have a powerful league in a closed league, but it's not really practical in something where the barrier to entry is going to be so low like it is in Overwatch. Hey, let's get 6 players together for a team, compared to something like soccer, football. Cities have been around a long time, things like that, for building the teams. Okay. For the fans, that's a real problem. Oh, we talked about that one. I can't imagine being a Vancouver fan when they dropped their whole roster after a few games during Season 3, or being a Valiant fan during the Season 3-4 interseason. I was a Paris fan during Season 2/3, and it was already hard to see all my favorite players dropped or sold during the Season 3 season. I mean, yeah. It's tough. Esports are a little tough. We're moving through players very fast in the esports world. We're moving through players very fast in the esports world. That's going to be something that we're going to have to find the solution to. Maybe the solution is, maybe there is no solution. Maybe that's how it has to be, but it doesn't really make sense to invest years training to do something for 1 to 2 years and get paid kind of an average coastal job paycheck to do those things that you then spent years prepping for, and not 40-hour week years, like, 60-hour week years prepping for, and then are working 60, 70-hour weeks for that year or two. So that's probably not, that's not great. Maybe the answer to that is unions. Maybe the answer to that is longer minimum mandatory contracts. But those aren't going to be great answers right now because Overwatch League isn't making a ton of money right now. So tough problem to solve. Maybe that just has to be how esports are, because people wear through them very quickly, and there's a lot more people who can play and be found and access these things, and it's much easier to find your next person playing a video game that is an online matchmaker that has SR, things like that, than it is to find your next basketball star when you have to physically go find them in some ways. Yes, they go to schools and there's tournaments, but you might not know that they're sitting there as the best player at a high school that you've never heard of when you're trying to recruit for your college team or your NBA team or whatever the case may be. And because it's harder to find the replacement, you're going to run your players a bit longer. Anyway, Valiant in Vancouver was way worse. At least Avala tried to do her best to get something competitive with very limited resources. Don't agree with her strategy or communication, but she tried. When you look at Vancouver, it seems like the coaching team wasn't even trying. Their tryouts were catastrophic. They didn't look for the best opportunities. They just stayed with the players they liked. I mean, that's the real world. I hate to break it to you. Who you know. With this logic, about 1/3 of the games are really uninteresting. What was the importance of last year's London versus Vancouver last time? Yeah, but the same issue happens in contenders. It's like, oh, look, it's contenders, and look, we can go back to some of the early days where you would see, I can't even remember some of the old, not very good teams, but you'd see the same team, like the same teams, two teams would get relegated season after season from contenders, which is an open league, and then they would beat up on all the trials teams and find their way right back into contenders. And they'd win 1, 2 matches in contenders, but just lose the rest of them. And those are kind of boring teams to watch because no, they weren't getting better. They weren't on a trajectory to like start beating more contenders teams, but they were better than tier 3. This was very true for early contenders. And it's just like, okay, that's how it's going to work. With how the talent is spread out, with where the talent is, that's what it is. And the league being open hasn't prevented that. They were still better, and it's still therefore boring to watch their matches because they're going to get crushed by the Phase 2s, the Atlanta Academies, the Gladiator Legions, those sorts of things. But they're also going to beat up on the teams that try to come up from trials against them. Okay. Now imagine if the bottom team in NA was dropped from the league. This game would have been hugely important for both teams. Sure. And yet, again, we see in contenders, they don't always defend their spots, but they were pretty good at defending their spots in the early days. Okay. In conclusion, in the end, as an EU fan used to open league formats, you're getting tired of OWL. I watched nearly all games during Season 2, most of the games during Season 3 and 4, but now I'm getting attached to some players or coaches, and then seeing them not getting a team next season. Well, you've been watching for 3 seasons. I'm not surprised you're getting bored. People flow in and out of how much they watch. I've had points in my life where I've not like watched the amount of baseball, for example, that you're watching of Overwatch here, but times in my life where I've paid more attention to how my local baseball team is doing, and times where I've paid no attention at all for multiple seasons in a row. Like, people are human. People, don't go, oh, let me just keep paying attention to the same thing forever and ever and ever. They move on. They conquer one challenge, they move on to the next. Like, that's not terrible. Or, they are interested in one thing and then they grow tired of a hobby and they move on to the next. Like, that doesn't sound like oh, it's the format that's wrong. And yeah, shaking up the format might make it more interesting to you, but I think that's not really possible when these teams paid 20 to 40 million to get their slots. And so like it might be good as a change of pace, but I don't think like it makes sense. Could it have been better from the get-go? It might have been. It really may have been better. It probably would have been better in this case. But I took the stance against you here because, again, you didn't really do it justice in your argument. Tired players and coaches. This wouldn't be a problem if they had a chance to compete again in tier 2, tier 3. They do have that chance. They absolutely have the opportunity to go compete in there. No one is stopping them from getting tier 3. Tier 3 is completely open. They can go sign up and get potentially nice redemption arc, but this isn't the case. You can get the redemption arc. You can go into tier 3, win your way up into tier 2, win in tier 2 repeatedly, and eventually, oh hey, you're going to get another shot back in the league. If you stack up, a year of first place finishes and you're qualified and people don't think it's, hey, you're getting carried by, the rest of your team, or you're getting carried by your staff, or you're getting carried by your roster or whatever, you'll get another shot. especially when Contenders has its regional stuff. They don't have Gauntlet stuff and haven't for a while, but back when Gauntlet was a thing, especially that. They're just not doing it, and I've covered why. Like good old underdog story of T2 beating everybody because they are super creative. They're not doing it because they're creative. They're doing it because they're better. I'm serious. When tier 2 is better than everyone, they're just better than everyone. And we've had times when that's not better than everyone, but when they're better than most of the Overwatch League teams. When the top couple tier 2 teams are better than most of the Overwatch League teams, those times have existed at multiple points in history, but they're not doing it by playing, oh, super different and super gimmicky and super we're on the next meta and Al hasn't figured it out yet. Little bit of that has happened occasionally, but that has more to do with patches. And yes, the changes do flow upward. The changes tend to get found. The big new discoveries tend to get found in tier 2, tier 2.5. That would be trials, that sort of thing. Sometimes now in collegiate, which we like to call tier 1.5, but that's not real. Like that changes get found in those places and they get pushed upwards, and then are they successful in tier 2? Yeah, then they get pushed upwards again because again, it's a closed league, but these teams do scrim each other. It happens. It does. It really does. And also, these coaches aren't dumb. They have some feedback of what's going on in tier 2. They're watching it, their scouts are watching it. Yeah. Okay. Shanghai Dragons were the best redemption arc. Nice, nice. Okay. Of course, US viewers might be most used to this format and cope with it. However, I'm convinced for non US viewers it's getting more and more frustrating. I think you're just frustrated with Overwatch, man. Like, it's getting more frustrating because you're going, hey, you're bored of playing the game. You're going, hey, they haven't given you new content. Hey, the company is having a lot of bad public relations, talent drain, that sort of thing. And this is a hobby that you've pretty heavily, it sounds like, watched for about 3 years in a row here. And it's, it's like, hey, you're just a little burned out. That's fine. That's fine. But it's not the format of the league that's burning you out. Okay. Open League is the traditional format, not closed one, in every country for nearly every sport. That's not true. So, open leagues and closed leagues, there's actually a decent comment about this down here. It was a pretty good response one here. You've actually got some decent responses here. All teams could always have scrimmed against tier 2 teams. This is not an issue with closed leagues. It's just an issue with competitive Overwatch in any format. They do. Redemption on a player level could maybe be better in an open league, sure, but there's not really any problems with the current system in terms of redemption in most people's eyes, I think, and it isn't something you should be basing your entire league around. While the incentive problem may be true, it's a bigger issue than the one that arises with an open league long term. Dominant franchises. While being right now, Al doesn't have too much to combat this because it's very focused. It isn't very focused on the long term for good reason. Even the smaller number of teams held immensely with this, because good players looking for spots on non-top tier teams only have a few options instead of infinite options. Uh, okay, so some interesting things there. We saw some other good ones. I thought I saw a good comment in here that was specifically open versus closed. Here we go. Both systems have pros and cons. As a long fan of closed league, disallows franchises from literally not giving a care. It's fine. We don't want lawsuits as valid. Closed league format is not much younger than open league format, a few years difference at most. Neither are the de facto traditional format. Open is traditional in Europe, closed is traditional in US. Pretty sure you also see closed pretty regularly in Australia, so it's not a strictly US versus the rest of the world thing. Okay, so that's kind of that. Again, I I like open leagues. I think open leagues are great. I'm totally fine with an open league, and if promotion had been allowed, I think there'd have been even more hunger in tier 2. And I think that would have been cool. But it was basically never going to happen. Um, It was never going to happen with the amount of money that Activision Blizzard wanted to make here. Also, though, it's not all bad that it didn't happen, was the primary point I wanted to make. Open League versus Closed League is not an inherently open leagues are better. Yes, you get, in some ways, better competition. There's reasons that you don't. I've covered those in terms of, hey, you don't necessarily, people who would be the best potentially move on because there's not enough money in the scene. But the other thing that you run into is money. Like, you get a lot more money into the scene when you have a closed league. You get better sponsorship dollars, you get bigger sponsorships. That means better tournaments. That means it's easier to get more people hooked in terms of watching it because they're produced better. That means you don't have to constantly be worrying about people with no media training saying terrible, terrible things on their social media, publicly, in interviews, things like that. That means you don't have to worry about players suddenly not getting paid in the middle of a tournament by their org, that sort of thing. Lots of things like this that you do a much better job of avoiding in some ways by having these closed leagues. Can you find ways to address these in open leagues? Yes. Can you find ways to address closed leagues problems in closed leagues? Yes. Anyway, just wanted to cover this one. It was kind of in the archive of things to cover. Hey, Little Link. I'm doing well. What about yourself? Temporal, get a sponsorship from Purple. Right, well, that's what I was talking about. I've talked about that before in terms of go for non-traditional sponsorships. You don't want to just go for the sponsorships that everyone tries to go for. Well, we're supposed to do gaming peripherals, so we'll go talk to those companies. Maybe we'll talk to energy drink companies. And that's what we do, right? Like, you have to get more creative. And I've used Purple as an example before. I think that's why you brought it up, where you go talk to people and you start figuring out, hey, it's relatively cheap to advertise here. It's going to get you this many eyeballs. It's going to get you them in a demographic that are, an earning demographic or a demographic that you want, and, a demographic that is open to ordering things on the internet. Here you go. Oh, okay. Well, that applies to a lot more categories. So maybe we do want to go reach out to, I don't know, Purple, Home Depot, whatever the case may be in terms of things that are not your traditional sponsorship areas. Can't sleep if Temporal is live. There you go. I put it in the Discord so you can email them. Okay. Even though you won't, but you can tell them that you have a lot of late night people who can't sleep and might be looking to upgrade their mattress to something more comfortable. Right. And that's the thing. And if you're running an org, or even if you're building an org, one of the first things you do is you yourself get very active in looking to try to go get the sponsorships, or you train your staff to be very effective of doing so. But that's not how most people are building their orgs. Most people are building their orgs from nothing to a, hey, we have a team. Let's get a manager. Let's get a coach. Okay, now what do we do? Well, I think we need to have some social media presence. It's like, yeah, you guys need all this stuff, but you also need to keep going. And they sort of end there and go, well, we need to win more. And it's like, winning more helps, but you guys need to be a lot more active in building your brand. As you build your brand, getting more sponsorships, all those things. And you have to actively do both those things, be that chasing down sponsorships, figuring out who to contact, who to wheedle, how to get your way in there, that sort of thing, figuring out, what you can do to build your brand, be that hosting tournaments, be that doing, running your own content, whatever the case may be there. That's a different video, though, and I've done that one. I don't care what is traditional format. In Warsaw, 2 major football teams. Super disappointed when Polonia was demoted from Major League. Tradition greater than performance. That would be another thing. It's a lot easier to hold a fan base when you can, again, invest in having your fan base and building your brand and having eyeballs on you if you know you're going to be there again next year. You're a lot less willing to put more money on the line in effectively advertising, building your brand, if your team performs poorly enough, you're going to effectively disappear off the map next season. Like, that's not something that's a less sound investment of your money. You're less willing to do it. You bring in less fans, again, less money in the scene. Isn't it like 1 a.m. there? What's with all these EU people? Yeah. The lack of sleep schedules, they'll gravitate to temporal. Hey, we're happy to have him. We're happy to have you regardless of what time it is where you are in the world. I mean, you too. For us, closed leagues are hearsay because we think it's killing the storytelling and competition. Closed league is not something we understand. I hear you, Super. And I think most of us, we like the merit based system of an open league. We do. But there's reasons that closed leagues exist, and it's not just, oh, let's be the greedy org owner or greedy league owner. Like, there are reasons. Yes, a lot of those reasons are money, but that's because money is what we use in general to transfer value, that sort of thing. And money allows you to have things like, oh, we can have better casters now. We can have a stadium now. We can not have to worry about, oops, our players haven't been paid for 6 months now. Temporal, if you would choose an owl team to coach, and let's pretend everyone would want to hire you ASAP, which team is that? I'd have to think a lot harder to answer that question. Maybe that'll be its own video at some point. Mm-hmm. Our team shouldn't be demoted. We would never have 38 streak from Shanghai Dragons, and then Epic come back with different roster, and Ginguri, who suffered some losing streak too. Okay, okay, fair. Redditor destroyed with facts and logic. We could call it that. We could. Uh, Okay, I think that's going to do it. If you guys are enjoying the content, please do drop a like. Consider subscribing if you haven't already done so. If you want to catch me live for this type of content, the best way to do so, other than ringing that notification bell next to the subscribe button, is to join my Discord in the description below. In there, you can go ahead and see what we're doing. You can see the cool communication that we've got going on, fun stuff, but you can also see when I go live. There's pings if you want to become a watcher in there. You won't get pings a ton just by joining my Discord, but you can hit that next step of reacting in get notifications to, well, get notifications when I go live, see what topic I'm covering. You can be part of that discussion. You can tell me how wrong I am and how open leagues are just superior in every single way. Again, I'm good with open leagues. I like open leagues personally, but closed leagues have some merit. Or you can go, oh yeah, hey, I have other questions. I want to pick your brain about this, whatever the case may be. But if you're enjoying, drop that like, consider subscribing, and I hope to see you guys next time. For those of you that want to see more, I guess I'm going away, but I do believe that there's going to be some Lieutenant Surge broadcasting his final takeover of the Sinnoh region there in the name of Team Rocket. So we'll have to see that last gym run and Elite Four. Later, guys. Temporal out.